Yesterday morning, you remember Steve Thomas ending his talk with, "I'm an old man," trying to peer into the future, I think rather unsuccessfully. I have a lot in common with that. And my observation point this morning is in rural Middle England, 4 miles from the nearest main road, our woodland on 3 sides, little carbon sink. Obviously, there are some disadvantages in the remoteness of such a house, but it's overwhelmingly advantageous. And from there, I can, I think, look out fairly calmly on what's going on around me. And I'd like to start by looking at the global scene, and particularly through United Nations agencies. And having worked with some 17 UN agencies over the years, I've got a bit of form in that as well. And so I'd like to start with the fact that we're over 40 years on from the 1972 Stockholm Conference. And recall that that did quite some good for transboundary air pollution, but very little else. And it seemed totally unaware that within a year or so, there would be a major first so-called oil crisis, something which some of us have been talking about for more than 2 years beforehand, not with precise timing, of course, but certainly by 1974-75. And I think the situation there, the awareness within the UN system of some of these things other than perhaps climatic change, with lip service to a few other environmental issues, remains pretty poor. It's also 30 years since Gro Harlem Brundtland was asked to head a commission on these matters, and the report they produced in 1987 concluded it did not believe that the dilemmas of sufficient energy supplies, energy efficiency and conservation measures, or environmental concerns were being addressed by the international community with a sufficient sense of urgency and in a global perspective. I think that remains true. Then came the Rio Earth Summit, where sustainable energy issues were only discussed in Chapter 9 under the heading The Protection of the Atmosphere, and then scarcely in a concrete fashion. I think it's really only in paragraph 9 of that chapter that they begin to get to grips with the subject, and then they retreat from it. Of course, at that time, in Rio, 155 governments signed up to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but that, in a sense, was a separate initiative which had been started a couple of years before from a different direction. So it's not entirely surprising that it was only in Rio +5 at the 19th special session of the UN General Assembly that delegates seemed to stumble on the notion of sustainable energy development for the first time, and a possible role for intergovernmental intervention. Better late than never, you might have thought. And yet the year 2000 Millennium Declaration made no mention of the word energy in any of its 32 clauses. It was only in the following year, at the 9th session of the UN Commission on Sustainable Development, that there was any intimation that energy might be essential to achieving the goals of sustainable development. Even then, it was rather vague. The UN Deputy Secretary General admitted, overall, the record card is very poor. At first sight, it looked as if things might have begun to pick up with the appearance of a UN-sponsored report, Energy Services for the Millennium Development Goals, in 2005, with its talk of achieving wider and greater access to energy services being critical to the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. But little has happened on that since 2005, except the creation in 2009 of the UN Advisory Group on Energy and Climate Change, which focused on widening access to energy services and on energy efficiency. Various aspirations were set out in the report they published in 2010, but little of real consequence has happened since. The Rio +20 Earth Summit showcased the UN initiative Sustainable Energy for All, with its 3 goals to be achieved by 2030, to ensure universal access to modern energy services, to double the rate of improvement in energy efficiency, and to double the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. The year 2012, you may recall, was designated by the UN as the International Year of Sustainable Energy for All. The effect was rather spoiled by parallel admissions that 3 billion people still rely on traditional biomass and a further 1.4 billion do not have access to modern energy services. Here in the UK, there are a growing number of people who fear they might join one or other of these groups as the EU's large combustion directive cuts a swathe through coal-fired electricity generation, gas storage capacity remains very modest, further nuclear plant closures remain in the pipeline, and the contributions of renewable energy, especially wind power, outside Scotland, Mr. Mackey, continue to be exaggerated. Whether the review of progress towards the Millennium Development Goals to take place in 2015 will advance matters must be a matter of some doubt. The UN system has already warned that a further 1.4 billion people risk being without modern energy services by 2030, largely as a result of population expansion. Then there's the role of UN agencies and other intergovernmental bodies in climatic change matters. Now, climatic change is a very complex subject, as we all know, and the subject of some controversy. Last week, the UK Met Office held a meeting to discuss what they termed the disappointing summers of recent years, out of which I had hoped, at least, there will come greater prudence about how well we can foresee the future of climatic change and closer focus on doing more sensible things about it. Suffice it for me to say that with so-called greenhouse gas emissions being pumped out in increasing volumes at the global level, their atmospheric concentration is likely to increase and thus raise the risks of enhanced near-surface global warming. I said so-called greenhouse gases because, of course, the Earth's atmosphere is not really like a greenhouse. This was, I think, understood by Edmund Marriott in the 1680s. It was understood by Fourier in the 1810s, 1820s. It was only Svante Arrhenius in 1896 that began to confuse le chaleur with la serre, and we're having to live with that mistaken concept since. But there are also natural variations and shifts in the capacity of the Earth's system, the oceans and forests in particular, to absorb some of these gases. Solar variation has recently been cited once again in some quarters as an important factor. Given the complexities and uncertainties, it's surely foolish not to take sound precautionary measures. I emphasize the word sound because, as I shall explain later, many things being done in the name of mitigating climatic change are not sound. This is not the place for me to explore closely the data on these so-called greenhouse gas emissions, but I do want to expand on one aspect of them. The initial Kyoto Protocol targets were whittled down. Some Annex I countries show large increases, up by almost 60%. Others claim larger decreases, such as the UK, down 23.2% since 1990 by 2010, according to the UNFCCC database. Germany is down, it claims, nearly as much. Norway claims an even greater reduction. What do these figures really mean? They're production-based. They do not reflect the national consumption basis of these Annex I countries. There's no reflection of the emissions embedded in imports of goods from China or India, for example, largely manufactured from coal-fired electricity generation. If these emissions embedded in UK imports were taken into account, for instance, almost all of the reduction of 23% since 1990 claimed would be wiped out. This is not a secret. The chief scientific advisors to the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change and of the Environment, Professor David Mackay and Sir Robert Watson, respectively, have pointed out, again respectively, that the official figures are an illusion and We've got to be more open about this. In September 2010, Sir Robert even concluded that if you took carbon emissions embedded in UK imports into account, a net increase of 12% had occurred since 1990. The UK Committee on Climate Change, reporting in April of this year, referred to the increase in the UK's carbon footprint in recent years. They said, because of the growth of our imports. The fact that some of these imports, many of them perhaps, are the result of closure of UK manufacturing facilities is irrelevant to the argument that the official figures and the basis for the Kyoto Protocol are of false perspectives. Indeed, the whole UN climatic negotiation process has been severely flawed. I've attended many of those meetings. Many questions have arisen over the past 20 years about the UNFCCC process. Why, for example, on the last morning of the Kyoto conference, did Chairman Estrada suddenly gavel out the original Article 10? I was there all night. I watched it. I've written about it. How many other people have? Now, that draft protocol covered the voluntary commitments by developing countries to curb or reduce emissions. Estrada had previously warned that the whole protocol was in peril because of disagreement on this article, acceptance of which was crucial for US support of the protocol in the wake of the Byrd-Hagel Senate resolution of the previous July. That resolution insisted, as one of its 2 points, that developing countries must take on some commitment. Well, by that final morning, apart from a bit of temporary grandstanding, because basically G77 plus China had signed up to it, but of course they would have to stand up in public and try to disavow it before they signed up. The chairman's action gaveling it out caused US ambassadors Stuart Einstein and head of US delegation Melanie Kimball to rush up to him to expostulate, but to no avail. Now, how did that happen? Why has there been no inquest on this? Why has so little been made of it? At the UNFCCC sessions have rode on year after dismal year, it has become almost obligatory for the Earth Negotiations Bulletin to report the session left many with the lingering feeling that much work needs to be done in a very limited amount of time. Given the amount of bracketed text that usually has to be fought over, this is not surprising. The one time that there was a last-minute attempt to introduce a short, clear alternative text in Copenhagen, it proved a disaster. The fact is that although alternatives may be difficult to propose, the UNFCCC system is deeply flawed. This, of course, has at least as much to do with the differing objectives of national governments as with aspects of the UN itself. The EU and some of its member states have taken a leading role in many of these UNFCCC proposals and debates, buoyed by the appearance of having made progress in curbing emissions. The UNFCCC recalls the EU15 as having reduced its emissions between 1990 and 2010 by 11.3%, and the EU27 having reduced them by 16.8%. Now, in the first case, the EU15, the failure to express emissions on a consumption basis in order to reflect embedded emissions means that the EU15 figure is grossly exaggerated. On a consumption basis, the EU15's carbon emissions between 1990 and 2010 may have risen close to 20%, not fallen 11%. I mean, the estimates, of course, are a little difficult to calculate. Widening this estimate to the EU27, which reflects the many changes since the breakup of the former Soviet Union, results in a significant decline for these countries, even when adjusted to a consumption basis. This represented a fall of about 50% in the contribution of the 12 additional countries to the EU total in 2010. Nevertheless, this drop was insufficient to offset the increase in the EU15's carbon emissions on a consumption basis. It did moderate the EU27 increase to about 10% between 1990 and 2010, but this is a far cry from the claimed 16.8% decline. The policy relevance of these figures becomes immediately apparent when we consider that the EU emissions target for 2020 and beyond Although it may be politically convenient to play along with the production-based declaration of carbon and other so-called greenhouse gas emissions, it is arguably intellectually dishonest. The EU target of reducing its emissions to 20% below 1990 levels by 2020 is seen to be 30 percentage points off course. I'm coming to the UK's position later. Thus, in my view, it is incorrect to claim, as the EU does, that the EU has put in place legislation to reduce its emissions to 20% below 1990 levels by 2020, and it's their emphasis, data show it is well on track to reach this target, close quote. Then there's the EU roadmap for moving to a low-carbon economy by 2050. This, it's suggested, should cut the EU's emissions to 80% below 1990 levels through domestic reductions alone, with targets of a 40% reduction by 2030 and 60% by 2040. I'm reminded of my former colleague, Professor John Dukes' view expressed almost 50 years ago. Those who have set out to make a man master of his economic destiny have left behind them a trail of economic wreckage, all the more melancholy because it was the outcome often of noble hopes and scientific pretensions. Intriguingly, too, the EU claims that the roadmap shows the main sectors responsible for Europe's emissions: power generation, industry, transport, buildings and construction, as well as agriculture, I'm quoting here, of course, can make the transition to a low-carbon economy most cost-effectively. No mention, you may notice, of households, of us, many already struggling to cope financially. I don't see how most people will be able to cut back, as these targets suggest they will have to, in any voluntary and acceptable fashion. I doubt very much that the next 2 generations will be prepared to, unless forced. Under the UK's Climate Change Act, a reduction in household electricity use of 27% by 2020 and of 40% by 2040 by 2040 is indicated. There's no hope of my household cutting electricity use by about 30% through improved insulation. We've gone through that at considerable cost. And look where we are in terms of the 15% of primary energy supply for the UK, to be 15% coming from new renewable sources by 2020. 30% of our electricity coming from new renewable energy sources. What are the latest figures? For primary energy, 4%. Do you imagine we can get from 4% to 15% in barely 7 years? Do you imagine we can get from 11.2%, the highest point last year in 1 quarter, to 30% in less than 7 years? These targets, these pretensions are really quite absurd. And I do not believe that our future energy supply prospects are anywhere near as rosy as such target setting suggests. I don't need to remind you that over 80% of the world's energy supplies still come from the fossil fuels, we've heard that, or that the level of subsidies to fossil fuels worldwide has been increasing in recent years by nearly 30% since 2010, and are likely to exceed $600 billion this year. Although in North Africa and Western Europe, oil consumption declined a little in 2012, overall, for the world, it rose nearly 1%. Although gas consumption fell in many European countries last year, it rose over 2% worldwide, including an increase of in fact, over 4% in the United States. Coal use too rose worldwide by 2.5%, with China accounting for just over 50% of world consumption, with a further rise of over 6% alone itself. China has increased its coal use by over 2.5 times since the year 2000. India only uses about 15% of China's coal by volume, with doubled its consumption since the year 2000. These figures put the quadrupling of world new renewable energy use, excluding hydropower, since the year 2000 in perspective. The total is still equivalent to less than India's coal use in 2012, and about 12.5% of China's. It is less than the oil used in the Philippines, or in Qatar, or in Norway, or in Switzerland in 2012. Indeed, total non-hydro new renewables use in 2012 represented less than one-third of the increase in hydropower's contribution since 2000. These comparisons are disappointing after over 20 years of intergovernmental and much national promotion of new renewable energy schemes. We've now reached the point when renewable energy sources account for just over 13% of global primary energy supply. But traditional biomass still accounts for just over 10 percentage points of this, and hydropower for a further 2.5 percentage points. All other forms of new renewable energy, modern biomass, wind power, direct solar, geothermal, and ocean wave, have risen to about 0.5%. Not exactly a giddy height. And among that 0.5%, there have been some very strange goings-on, as I will be explaining shortly. In terms of electricity generation, new renewables account for under 3% of the world total. However, as we all know, much has been going on in the oil and gas world, as we read daily in reports on shale gas and now shale oil. And the story has been going around over the past couple of years that the notion of peak oil is either a myth or an irrelevance, and we've heard quite a bit about that over the last couple of days. And of course, what has been singled out are the proved oil reserves as published in BP Statistical Review, the Oil and Gas Journal, and by the US EIA. Well, there are three main reasons for that, and I'd just like to look at in the detail of that a little bit, because we've obviously seen some graphs on that. Well, first of all, the 5 major Middle East OPEC oil exporters have shifted their definition of we've known from proved conventional oils, the P1, if you like, the 90% probability, to the P2 or 50% probability over the past 20 years, encouraged, of course, by the OPEC's production quota arrangements. Well, this alone has resulted in essentially an artificial increase in proved oil reserves of some 435 billion barrels. Then Venezuelan heavy oil has been added to what was a conventional oil data series. This accounts for a further rise of 298 billion barrels. The third reason is that Canadian tar sands have been added to the series as well, make up a further 174 billion barrels. Thus, of the world total of proved oil reserves claimed as being 1.67 trillion barrels in 2012, 471.5 billion, the Venezuelan Canadian bits, are not conventional oil, to which needs to be added the further 435 billion barrels massaged upwards by the 5 major Middle East OPEC member states. There's been a little bit of manipulation by Libya, by Nigeria, but it really doesn't account for that. There also appears to be little or no reflection by the 5 major Middle East OPEC member states of their conventional oil production offtake over the past 3 decades or so. Because between January 1984 and December last year, this production figure totaled just over 280 billion barrels. What the standard published figures appear to tell us, therefore, is that at least half the claimed 1.67 trillion barrels of proved oil reserves figure is probably spurious. There have, of course, long been suggestions that the claimed oil reserves figures of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, Abu Dhabi, are all overstated by some 130 billion barrels in the case of Saudi Arabia, by 50 billion barrels in the case of Kuwait, by 26 billion barrels in the case of Abu Dhabi, respectively. There have also been questions over the availability of some heavy Saudi crudes for current refinery configurations and final market requirements. And as those of you who've supplied refineries and markets will know, crude oil qualities may not always suit the requirements and configurations of refineries and final markets. And there's the curious case of the recent development of the Manifa field, where the Saudis appear to be of a mind to hold back on production of that in order to compensate for falls in production in other fields. So, apart from all that, you've then got the problems posed of exploiting and refining Venezuelan heavy and Canadian tar sands, which of course pose further challenges and costs, including environmental ones. The recovery of a claimed recoverable 350 barrels of shale oil also poses such challenges, including the implications of research findings that appeared in the oil drum and that the ERRI, the energy return on energy invested of shale oil, is a mere 5 to 1, less than half that of the lowest ERRI figure yet produced for conventional oil. Interestingly, BP, in publishing its 2013 statistical review of world energy, headed its note on oil reserve definitions with the disclaimer, "Nobody knows or can know how much oil exists under the Earth's surface or how much it will be possible to produce in the future." Close quote. The conclusion I draw from this is that the current mainstream published proved oil reserves figures are too high, and it is too early to write off the peak oil hypothesis. We all need to recall also the warnings that have been given ever since 1975, to my certain knowledge, that oil price rises can snuff out global economic recovery. As I mentioned, there's also the view that the peak oil hypothesis is an irrelevance in the wake of expanding US shale gas supplies and the prospect of 350 billion barrels of recoverable from shale oil. Well, we saw that figure of Bakken, sliding down like that. We've seen similar stuff coming out from Marcellus. Yet shale gas will not provide anyway much comfort to the transportation sector unless there's mass conversion of transport fleets to either electric vehicles or gas-powered ones with all the ancillary support required. And that doesn't happen overnight. What has happened, of course, is that shale gas has already both caused a massive cut in US gas prices with interesting wider implications for competitiveness, not least for European companies, but also coal prices. And not only US coal prices, Colombian coal prices, etc. One consequence already clear in the energy statistics is increased shipments of coal from the US to Europe, with a counterintuitive result for those propounding the urgent need for mitigation of climate change, that the burning of coal in European electricity generating has increased in many countries. Thus, in 2012, the UK increased its coal consumption by 24% over 2011, the highest volume since 2006. Spain increased by 19%, Italy by 16%, the Netherlands by 8%, Germany by 4%, and although the volume was rather small, Ireland increased its coal consumption by 17%. And overall, the EU increased its coal consumption by 3.4% in 2012 over 2011, while the US decreased its coal consumption by nearly 12% over the previous year. For Germany, in the wake of the post-Fukushima panic, it looks particularly bad news given an earlier coal subsidy system in place until 2018, closure of nuclear power stations and opening of new coal-fired ones, and taxes and duties on electricity use increased by 25% this year to nearly 32 billion euros amidst increasingly vocal opposition. So it's not surprising that with the elections looming that Mrs. Merkel has been calling for a reduction in government spending on wind and solar power. Indeed, Germany's Energiewende no longer looks like an energy wonder. Anyway, let me leave on the grounds of time Germany and countries outside the UK and focusing a bit more on renewable energy, because there are some even more fundamental questions which need to be asked and satisfactory answers given. First, according to Václav Smil, who has looked into these things more closely than anyone else I know, has pointed out they all have far lower power densities than the fossil fuels, with the possible exception of hydro, with biomass and wind at the bottom of his particular list. Secondly, with the exception of hydropower, they all have lower EROIs than the conventional fossil fuels, as Charlie Hall, Cutler, Cleveland, and others have pointed out. I must confess to thinking that some of these findings are too overgeneralized in terms of EROI, for example, to claim a single EROI ratio of 18 to 1 for wind turbines when so much depends upon the mean wind speeds of where turbines are located and how carefully they're located, seems liable to be wide of the mark. Or to claim solar PV has an EROI ratio of 6.8 to 1 without considering solar irradiation levels in the locality. Of course, if there are no alternatives to solar PV, for example, as we saw from Jeremy Leggett's presentation yesterday morning, For example, to provide light by which people can work and study in many poorer economies, the social or economic return on energy invested may be much more relevant than the energy return on energy invested. But you have to be also a little careful here, because over the last 25 years, as Eskom discovered in South Africa, people don't necessarily think that solar PV, solar home systems are a superior product if there is a grid connection which is possible. They think that a grid connection is socially more acceptable, and they will decline or dump what they previously had in terms of solar PV or solar home system more generally. Anyway, what are the issues as I see them? Well, let's start with the so-called modern biomass and biofuels, the exploitation of which 5 years ago Jean Ziegler, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, called a crime against humanity. Well, the World Bank reckoned that in the wake of food price riots in 47 countries, that the expansion of biofuels and their impact on low grain stocks, together with speculative activity and bans on exports, was responsible for some 70 to 75% of those food price rises. The US National Academy of Science has pointed out how modest the contribution to US road transportation use, the total devotion of land given over to corn and soybean production would be. So modern biomass, my view, certainly first generation, is a no-no, and little progress is being made on second and third generation. Tidal energy, well, people seem to forget that when EDF exploited the La Rance by Saint-Malo, they claimed they destroyed the local ecology. Canada, they closed Annapolis on environmental grounds, and they've not proceeded with Cumberland and Minas basins. Yeah, we still have, as we've had since 1849, people wanting to put an estuarine barrage across the Severn. Okay, it's turbid, and apart from the shell duck, there's not a very wide range of bird species for the Severn. But you look further north, the Conway, up through to the Solway Firth. These are much more sensitive estuaries. There's not just birds, by the way. There's a subspecies of sea bass in the Conway, which needs to be considered. Maybe not that important for most of you. But nevertheless, when it comes to overwintering and migratory birds, these estuaries are extremely important, would provide very little electricity generation. And even the Severn is unlikely to provide 5% of UK current requirements as claimed. It's likely to be barely half of that. Then there are equally awkward questions raised about wind power. And I think I'm beginning to get short of time, so I'm going to cut out quite a bit of what I've got in my paper on this. But one of the things that we need to realize, and Jim Oswald and other people have written about this in energy policy, is if the wind is not blowing in the English Channel, it's unlikely to be blowing in the Irish Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Bay of Biscay, and so on. And what conclusion did he reach from that? Well, the problem of intermittency is not confined to onshore developments. There is a problem here. Offshore, people can't object very much to visual impact. Mean wind speeds are almost certainly going to be in excess of 9 meters a second at 45 meters above sea level and so on. So the normal grounds of opposition are not there. So although installation maintenance costs are relatively high, there are no real other problems. But as Jim Oswald suggests, he said that all this suggests that intercontinental transmission grids to neighbouring countries will be difficult to justify. Well, not totally perhaps opposed, but nevertheless a problem. Denmark, they claim over 20% of their electricity comes from their own wind power, but of course because of their two grid systems, they actually only use about half of that, and the else is exported to Norway, to Sweden, to Germany. Particularly Norway and Sweden, of course, have other options, particularly hydro, and in the case of Sweden, nuclear as well. The other great hope, solar power. Well, concentrating solar power, we've heard about the Desertec system, and then we've got Frank Schumann's effort of Media back in 1912, and we're still talking about it. And meanwhile, we've had the Arab dawn and more difficult socio-political conditions in North Africa. This is a great pity because in the long term, this is the big hope, concentrating solar power with ultra-high voltage direct current transmission. Solar PV, yes, again, a lot of questions have been asked about that. The work of Pedro Prieto and Charlie Hall, the work in Australia of Graham Palmer. And of course, there are other renewable energy technologies that can make a modest contribution. One can think of shores of Scotland, tidal stream, wave, and so on. And also, of course, Scotland has this enormous advantage that not only has it a strong wind resource, it also has a large hydro resource, and as a result of that, a large storage resource. But then people claim that new renewables will achieve sort of 80% or so of, or 100% of primary energy supply by 2050. Well, I have to say that these sorts of things that come from WWF, etc., and indeed involve the Fraunhofer Institute, I noticed the other day, I think are completely absurd. REN 21 have sensibly been more cautious with their newest report, How Much Renewables, where they set out the range of opinion from what it characterizes as the conservative view taken by oil companies and some industry groups, the IEA and the US EIA, that renewable energy will show a share of under 15% of total energy by 2040 or so, and really that's about as good as it gets. IASA's huge global energy assessment report reckoned that on its high efficiency case, it could achieve 75% and a 55% medium. Well, in my view, I suspect that traditional biomass by 2050 will still be accounting for 5 to 10% of obviously a much larger global primary energy demand, and that the new renewable contribution is unlikely to be any more than 25%. That, I think, could be even quite an optimistic view, considering where we are. Because where we are, of course, is that even on electricity, new renewable energy resources worldwide are only providing 3%. And why has there been so little discussion of the concepts of useful energy as propounded by Bob Ayres over the decades? The concept of energy return on energy invested, Cutler, Cleveland, Charlie Hall. Few people have taken this up except for Dave Murphy in recent years. Why hasn't it been extended as Jessica Lambert does with Charlie Hall and various others in the forthcoming special issue of the Energy Policy Journal, Oil and Gas in the 21st Century, to social return on energy invested? Now, these are, I think, very important issues, and I'm absolutely delighted, and I read this before I knew that Simon was going to be here, but I'm pleased to be able to report, I wrote, that the research for 2 of the papers to be published in this special issue was supported by the UK Department for International Development, and I added, you may consider by now that I'm sparing in my praise for official initiatives. But a more fundamental perspective is to be undertaken. It will immediately be confronted by the view of Ed Davey, Secretary of State at the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change. As renewable energy developers in the UK only get paid for the electricity they produce, these other matters are of no importance. How wrong he is. Do these developments not cost money, involve the use of rare materials, some of them with high global warming potentials, and where placed in suboptimal locations, emphasized in suboptimal locations, divert scarce resources from where they could be better used. Well, now let me come back, as I draw towards a close, to my local vantage point. I mean, can you believe, for instance, that a UK planning inspector can approve a scheme for the simple burning of palm oil in a small electricity generating plant, even when the evidence of associated carbon emissions, tropical deforestation, habitat and species loss have been pointed out to him? That a developer can claim that they never contemplate proposing to place turbines where, according to the official wind speed database, wind speeds at 45 metres above ground level are below 6.5 metres per second? When a cursory glance shows that 50% of the turbines are indeed in areas below that. that the investigations branch of the UK's Advertising Standards Authority cannot distinguish between total revenues and subsidies. That the Advertising Standards Authority appear quite happy when a developer claims their proposed development in one of England's lowest mean wind speed areas could achieve the third highest capacity factor of all England's onshore developments in 2007, and fall back on defence that they consulted an expert, whom, of course, they refused to name. Or the planning inspector who has claimed in several decisions that various onshore wind energy developments in England could achieve 100% capacity factors. I'm the nearest one to me, and actually we have a family involvement, and they know my views on this. They were in Wikipedia under capacity factor, saying that it basically achieve close to 25%. Actually, the rolling average is 20%. It has been as low as 16.3%. This just arouses public antagonism and makes it more difficult for people in Scotland, where there's plenty of wind, to actually justify their proposals. It's very sad. Anyway, I could go on creating individual cases. The strange business of the single case in Cornwall, claiming that these things have absolutely no effect on property values. This despite the fact it was right by where Dr. Amanda Harry's patients were coming in, living up to 1.5 kilometres from the nearest wind turbine, and claiming loss of sleep and adverse health impacts from aerodynamic modulation. The complaints made about ETSU R97, the noise standards for wind, which were manipulated, which have been attacked by experts like Dick Bowdler, Mike Stigwood, and the latest Institute of Acoustics statement, which has been clearly exposed as ill-founded in a statement from the Renewable Energy Foundation on the 20th of May this year. Little impressions made on planning inspectors of cumulative visual impacts and so on and so forth. And I could raise questions about the major feature in the Sunday Telegraph of June the 16th, which challenged the claims of the wind energy industry that it is a major source of employment in this country. Instead, the report suggested the industry employed 12,000 people last year at a subsidy of £100,000 per person employed, when the total subsidy to the industry was £1.2 billion paid by the long-suffering electricity customer. And you know, of course, that the US component of the capital costs of wind are just about £2 billion a year at the moment, against total costs of about £10.7 billion. In other words, the net import component of that is very high, and I don't know what it means in terms of embedded emissions, but it can't be completely negligible. So there we are. It's the question of, finally, about the UK being the windiest country in Europe. No, it's not. Scotland's the windiest country in Europe. England is actually, apart from a few near coastal areas, it's actually not windy at all. So why is it that the companion guide to the main renewable energy planning document, PPS 22, claims that on average these wind energy developments achieve a capacity factor of 30% with the range 20 to 50%? Now the fact is that for Scotland, the rolling average is about 30%. For England, it is 23.6%. So for the UK as a whole, the average is about 26%. But by the way, you should remember that range 20 to 50%. In 2010, nearly 60% of onshore UK wind energy, onshore England onshore developments failed to achieve 20%. Nearly 6%. In 2009, 30% failed to achieve 20%. In 2011, 28% failed to achieve it. It's partly because they're so badly located, they should never have been put up in the first place. And this undermines the case for those which are well located where mean wind speeds are satisfactorily high. Well, I challenged this in a paper that was published by International Institute of Applied Economics, so I won't go into that anymore. There have been claims which, by Graham Sinden, for instance, back in a paper in Energy Policy in 2007, that there's 1 hour in 5 years when there's insufficient wind to have some wind turbines turning around. Well, he covered 64 Met Office stations over a period of 34 years. I was interested in this, and I looked into it for October 2007 for the 64 Met Office stations, and I chose, out of the blue, 1,900 hours, and I found that on 11 days there was insufficient wind. So I contacted Graham Sindon, and I have to say that the answers I got were not satisfactory, and I didn't bother to check back further. However, that's published, and Reinhard Haus was the co-editor or the editor of that particular special issue, and I believe he's here. It'd be nice to see him again. So, given the poor power densities, poor ERIs and so on, policymakers really must make much more of an effort to focus on where best to place these schemes, and particularly within the UK, wind energy power. I know that the Director of Renewables UK once claimed that quotation of capacity factors, even though derived from the operator's own data supplied to Ofgem, that these data were bizarre pseudoscience, absolute nonsense, and ill-informed and disingenuous. But for reasons of both policy and economics, I know of no better way of examining the efficacy, not the efficiency. Again, the Renewables UK tend to confuse that, the efficacy of onshore wind energy developments. So, for rural dwellers in England, our hopes rose on the 6th of June, when it was announced that local communities would be given the power to block wind farms under new planning rules. The Secretary of State for Local Government said he wished to give local communities a greater say on planning, to give greater weight to the protection of landscape, heritage, and local amenity. But concurrently, the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change suggests a new system of incentives could lead to an increase of turbines. These incentives, according to the Department of Energy and Climate Change, centred on giving a local community agreeing to a wind energy development proposal a reduction in power bills of an average of £400 per year. Now, in some quarters, this was criticised as a bribe, in others as an insult to people whose house values, visual outlook, and in some cases health, have been or will be adversely affected. The Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change did not help matters by stating, "We remain committed to the deployment of appropriately sited onshore wind. This is an important sector supporting thousands of new jobs and providing a significant share of electricity." Did he mean to imply that the siting onshore wind to date has been appropriate? That 12,000 jobs is significant? That 3.2% is all that significant? And on that note, I think it is time that I stop. My conclusions are that the global, regional, national, and local levels, energy policy shows evidence of being in a shambolic state. The economics of many energy schemes appear suboptimal, not least when promoted through subsidies. Insufficient attention is paid to some fundamental concepts, such as useful energy, power densities, ERIs, and even where best to locate wind and solar systems. To use currently fashionable US parlance, there is evidence of a rigged kleptocracy, which bodes ill for us all. We need sound policies, sound measures, and sound investments. And all too often, we're not getting them. Thank you.